Karl Marx entered the world in 1818 in the quiet German town of Trier, not exactly the breeding ground for class warfare. Trier wasn't a Dickensian nightmare of soot and hunger. It was a postcard. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a prosperous lawyer, respected and practical enough to trade his Jewish faith for Lutheranism, when the Prussian state decided Jews couldn't hold government positions. Ideological flexibility ran in the family long before Karl turned it into a profession. Young Karl had a life that would make any 19th century factory worker want to throw a shoe. Tutors, a fine home, libraries filled with Enlightenment texts, the kind of upbringing where struggle meant not getting dessert. He was a privileged kid reading Rousseau and Hegel, while servants made sure his life ran smoothly. It's the historical equivalent of railing against billionaires from your iPhone. From early on, Marx had a flair for dramatics and a talent for being insufferable. Teachers noted his brilliance, but also his arrogance, a combination that never goes out of style. He didn't just want to understand the world. He wanted to correct it, loudly, and usually in ways that involved someone else doing the work. His early essays show flashes of the future firebrand, but also the unmistakable tone of a man who's never had to clock in or pay a bill. Trier's calm prosperity bored him. Revolution, he decided, was more exciting, especially when you didn't have to live through it. His father hoped he'd follow a respectable path in law or academia, but Karl had other plans. A life dedicated to dismantling systems from within, financed by the very system he despised. The irony started young. Marx loved to criticize authority, but he thrived on it. Teachers, family, and later wealthy patrons all kept him afloat while he railed against dependency. If entitlement had a face, it would be 20-year-old Karl Marx writing angry manifestos with his father's money. By the time he left Trier, he had everything a future revolutionary could ever need. No financial discipline, a superiority complex, and a lifelong aversion to practical labor. He was, in every sense, a man perfectly prepared to explain to the working class how to live without ever joining them. College, or how to get expelled for being too loud about nothing. Marx's college years were less about intellectual enlightenment and more about testing how long a man could coast on arrogance and beer. He enrolled first at the University of Bonn, where his main academic focus became advanced leisure studies. He joined student clubs, fencing fraternities, and drinking societies, all the essential foundations of revolutionary theory, obviously. Within a year, he had racked up debts, injuries from duels, and the reputation of a man who could start an argument in an empty room. To his professors, Marx was infuriatingly intelligent and equally insufferable. He'd read half a book, then lecture everyone else about how they misunderstood it. He wrote essays about freedom while living off his father's wallet, a pattern that would define the rest of his life. And like every privileged contrarian ever, he mistook rebellion for originality. Eventually, Bonn had enough of his antics. Between the alcohol-fueled brawls, missed exams, and a police report or two, the university invited him to pursue opportunities elsewhere. Academic language for please get the hell out. Marx transferred to the University of Berlin, where he decided to get serious. Translation: he replaced beer with caffeine and swapped dueling scars for existential despair. At Berlin, he fell under the spell of Hegelian philosophy, a dense, labyrinthine system of thought that basically said everything exists as a contradiction of something else. It was tailor-made for Marx, abstract, circular, and impossible to fact-check. He spent sleepless nights debating dialectical synthesis while failing to synthesize his rent payments. He joined every radical intellectual circle he could find. These were gatherings of men who claimed to hate the establishment, but also needed it to pay for their wine. They called themselves the Young Hegelians, which sounds like a boy band, but produced fewer hits. They'd meet in smoky cafes, denounce religion, critique the monarchy, and, of course, avoid employment. Marx was their loudest voice. Not their smartest, just their loudest. Women found him intense, if exhausting. His future wife, Jenny von Westphalen, would later admit she admired his passion, which is a polite way of saying he never shut up. Marx turned every conversation into a manifesto draft, every disagreement into proof that he was surrounded by fools. Imagine a 19th century college kid who thinks every group chat needs his opinion. That was Karl. His PhD thesis, written in 1841, was on ancient Greek philosophers, mostly because he could use them to make veiled insults about modern politics. The university accepted it, probably just to make him go away. Marx had no plans to teach, no job prospects, and no backup plan. He'd earned a doctorate in arguing, a degree that would pay exactly nothing. By the time he left academia, Marx had perfected two lifelong habits: overanalyzing everything and producing nothing of material value. He wasn't ready for the working world, but that was fine. He'd soon decide work was the problem. The budding journalist who forgot to get paid. After finishing his PhD in philosophy, essentially a degree in thinking too much, Marx realized that academia expected him to work. Naturally, he pivoted to journalism, the perfect refuge for someone who wanted to argue without measurable results. He moved to Cologne and joined Rheinische Zeitung, a liberal newspaper that specialized in long sentences, self-importance, and outrage, Marx's natural habitat. For the first time in his life, he had an outlet for his opinions and no parental supervision. He attacked monarchies, the Prussian government, religion, property owners, and sometimes just the general concept of joy. Marx didn't report news. He philosophized at readers until they either agreed or passed out. Every column sounded like a manifesto draft, accidentally published as an editorial. He wrote about the oppression of the people, though his personal experience with oppression consisted of running out of wine before payday. When criticized, he'd accuse detractors of being bourgeois pawns. Marx's talent for criticism was unmatched, but his understanding of deadlines, editors, or fiscal responsibility was non-existent. If Substack had existed in the 1840s, he'd have been its most prolific and least profitable writer. He was technically employed, but rarely paid, partly because the paper was constantly fined by authorities, and partly because Marx treated money as a theoretical concept. His friends noticed he could spend hours explaining the nature of economic exploitation, but couldn't explain where his rent money went. His wife Jenny would later note that Karl was a genius with ideas and a catastrophe with receipts. Still, he was magnetic. His articles were furious, sharp, and often hilarious, until the Prussian government noticed that being hilarious about monarchy was still illegal. In 1843, the paper was shut down for sedition. Marx, ever the opportunist, declared this proof that his ideas were dangerous to the system. In truth, they were mostly dangerous to the paper's financial stability. He responded to his firing by doing what he'd do best for the rest of his life: blame capitalism. The same man who couldn't keep a job would soon argue that jobs themselves were the problem. It was a kind of genius, turning personal failure into political theory. After Cologne, Marx briefly tried to run another paper with fellow radicals in Paris. It also collapsed, possibly from lack of funds, possibly from exhaustion after reading his articles. He spent most of his Paris years ranting in cafes about revolution, freeloading off friends, and perfecting his tragic hero scowl. By the end of this period, he'd cemented his identity. the unemployed intellectual who saw himself as the voice of the voiceless, though he'd never met any of them. Marx wasn't living the proletarian struggle. He was living the influencer struggle. Lots of followers, no paycheck, endless outrage. Jenny von Westphalen, the saint who married a disaster. If Karl Marx was a walking contradiction, Jenny von Westphalen was the long-suffering witness to it. She came from Prussian nobility, educated, cultured, used to a life with servants and social grace. Out of all available men, officers, bureaucrats, respectable heirs, she chose the one who thought shaving and steady income were tools of bourgeois oppression. It was love, or possibly a long-term neurological event. They married in 1843, despite Jenny's family practically waving red flags of their own. Her father warned that Marx had an excessive taste for abstraction, which is aristocrat code for "this man will never pay a bill." Within months, the newlyweds were living in Paris on loans, idealism, and Jenny's inherited spoons. Karl promised revolution. Jenny got eviction notices. While Marx wrote about the dignity of labor, Jenny was performing it, scrubbing, cooking, nursing children, and negotiating with angry landlords in broken French. When bills arrived, Karl philosophized. When food ran out, he delivered another tirade about the injustice of property. It's possible that if he'd written a treatise called On Paying the Rent, history might have turned out differently. Friends described Jenny as radiant, articulate, and absurdly loyal. She believed in her husband's brilliance, even as that brilliance couldn't afford candles. Their letters show a tragicomic balance. Jenny begging creditors for mercy, while Karl debated the metaphysics of surplus value. She wrote with grace. He wrote IOUs. Their first child, Jennichen, was born into this chaos, tiny, hungry, and already acquainted with Marxist theory by osmosis. 2 more children followed, each one welcomed with philosophical musings and mounting debt. Marx insisted the struggle made them stronger. Jenny likely preferred groceries. When Marx's writings got him expelled from one country after another, Jenny followed him through Brussels, Paris, and finally London. Each move another level of poverty. By London, they were living in a slum so bad that even the rats probably filed complaints. Yet Jenny kept writing letters home, describing Karl as tireless in thought. That's one way to phrase unemployed. To outsiders, their marriage looked like devotion. To historians, it's performance art in endurance. Jenny pawned her jewelry, her dresses, even her family heirlooms. Every time Karl published something that attacked private property, it was indirectly sponsored by the liquidation of hers. She was the silent investor of communism, funding the revolution 1 silver spoon at a time. What's most astonishing is that she never abandoned him. She edited his drafts, soothed his manic rants, buried 3 of their children, and somehow maintained the conviction that he was destined for greatness. History later canonized Marx as a visionary. Jenny deserves recognition as the patron saint of underpaid genius enablers. By the mid-1840s, Marx's ideological fire was blazing, but so was the collection agency at his door. Jenny was tired, thin, and chronically underfed. The man who promised equality to all humanity couldn't even equalize his household's meals. She was the first casualty of Marxist economics, decades before it became a national policy. London, the capital of hypocrisy and capitalism. By the late 1840s, Marx had been kicked out of enough countries to qualify for a frequent exile program. His grand theories had gotten him banned from Germany, Belgium, and France, leaving him with one final refuge: London, the undisputed capital of the very capitalism he despised. The irony was not lost on anyone but him. He arrived broke, disheveled, and already mid-rant about economic injustice. London was then the global epicenter of industry, innovation, and empire, a city where fortunes were made and poor people died, inventing new ways to starve. Marx settled in Soho, the perfect neighborhood for someone who wanted to feel revolutionary without the inconvenience of hygiene. Life there was brutal. The Marx family lived in a 2-room flat that doubled as a daycare, office, and tuberculosis incubator. Karl spent most of his time in the British Museum, pretending to research while mostly staying warm for free. He filled notebooks with dense theories on labor, profit, and exploitation, all while surviving off Engels' remittances. It's easy to theorize about alienation when your best friend pays your rent. It was in this period that Marx began writing his magnum opus, Das Kapital, a massive critique of capitalism so impenetrable that even dedicated communists pretend they've read it. The book took decades to finish because Marx couldn't resist rewriting entire chapters to win arguments no one else was having. The result was a work of staggering influence and staggering unreadability. The central premise was simple. Workers were exploited, capitalists were parasites, and history would inevitably lead to revolution. The subtext was simpler. Engels, please send more money. Marx's letters from the time oscillate between philosophical insights and grocery requests. One day he's outlining the labor theory of value. The next, he's begging for cash to replace his pawned overcoat. His hypocrisy reached performance art levels. By day, he thundered against the evils of wealth. By night, he accepted financial lifelines from the heir to a cotton factory. Marx was essentially the prototype for the modern influencer who rails against billionaires from a MacBook Pro. Londoners found him fascinating, in a please don't invite him to dinner way. He'd corner intellectuals at cafes and deliver spontaneous lectures about surplus value until they fled. When someone pointed out that capitalism had given him both coffee and a printing press, Marx dismissed it as contradiction in motion. Translation: I'm not wrong, you're just too capitalist to understand. Despite the chaos, this was Marx's most productive period, mainly because he had no other options. Poverty was both his subject and his lifestyle. Jenny managed the household like a wartime general, feeding their children on borrowed bread, while Karl described starvation as dialectically interesting. And yet, history owes him something. Das Kapital changed the intellectual world. It gave generations of revolutionaries a blueprint, and generations of economists a migraine. Marx saw the system's cracks clearly, even if he was too self-absorbed to live outside them. If you're enjoying this absurd historical roast, subscribe to Ancient Absurdity, because unlike Karl, we actually work for a living. Friedrich Engels, the rich friend who funded the revolution. Every freeloading genius needs a benefactor, and Marx hit the jackpot with Friedrich Engels, the wealthy heir to a Manchester cotton empire. Engels was everything Marx wasn't: charming, disciplined, and employed. He managed his father's factory by day, and spent his nights writing fiery essays about how factories were evil. That's right. The man funding Karl Marx's revolution made his money the old-fashioned way, by owning the means of production. Their friendship began as mutual admiration and quickly evolved into financial codependency. Marx supplied the radical ideas. Engels supplied the rent money. Their correspondence reads like a 19th century Venmo history. Engels sending cash, Marx apologizing, Engels forgiving, repeat. Whenever Marx claimed to be working tirelessly for the cause, what he really meant was, Engels just wired another month's groceries. It's almost poetic. Communism itself was bankrolled by capitalism. Engels' factory profits flowed directly into Marx's manuscript drafts, literally converting exploited labor into anti-capitalist literature. Every time Engels paid Marx's debts, the revolution took one more bourgeois-funded step forward. Without Engels' checks, Das Kapital would have been Das unpaid bill. Engels knew the hypocrisy but didn't care. He loved Marx's mind and shared his vision. Plus, funding him gave Engels a guilt-free excuse to enjoy his own wealth. He was, in modern terms, a socially conscious rich kid sponsoring his favorite broke philosopher. Think of Engels as the original tech billionaire who offsets his emissions by planting a few theoretical forests. Their partnership worked because both men needed each other desperately. Marx needed a steady income. Engels needed a purpose that didn't involve spreadsheets. Together, they built an empire of theory. Engels polished Marx's drafts, defended him in public, and explained his more incoherent ramblings to anyone who'd listen. Without Engels, Marx might have been just another angry pamphleteer, yelling in cafes about false consciousness. Marx, for his part, showed impressive consistency. He borrowed endlessly and thanked rarely. He would write letters saying, "My dear Engels, I'm drowning in debt again," which might as well have been his life motto. Engels kept paying, sometimes even lying to Marx's creditors to buy time. At one point, he quietly sold part of his factory share just to clear Marx's arrears. To put it bluntly, if communism were a startup, Engels was the venture capitalist. The irony is beautiful. The most famous critic of profit was kept alive by it. Capitalism literally incubated its own worst enemy. And the dynamic didn't end with money. Engels also played therapist, editor, and part-time crisis manager. When Marx's domestic life imploded, Engels offered to claim paternity of one of Marx's illegitimate children. Yes, he literally covered his friend's moral and financial debts. If loyalty were an economic system, Engels invented socialism right there. The Marx-Engels partnership was, in hindsight, less revolutionary brotherhood and more toxic codependency with footnotes. But it worked. Engels' funding allowed Marx to shape ideas that would eventually shake governments. The rich man's money printed the poor man's manifesto. History celebrates Marx as the thinker who dismantled capitalism, but in truth, he was the world's most eloquent dependent. Without Engels, Karl Marx would have been just another broke guy with a beard shouting at pigeons in Soho Square. Family life in the Marx household. Theoretical prosperity, real poverty. The Marx household was where ideology met insolvency. Picture a cramped London flat stuffed with books, unpaid bills, and the kind of atmosphere that makes landlords develop migraines. Marx lived surrounded by poverty, not because he had to, but because he thought it was philosophically enlightening. He wasn't living in misery. He was studying it. Or at least, that's what he told himself, while Jenny sold the last of their furniture. Their apartment on Dean Street was infamous. Neighbors complained about the stench, the shouting, and the mysterious absence of rent payments. Visitors described it as a mix between a library and a crime scene. The floorboards were rotting, the children were sick, and yet Karl sat at his desk writing about how industrial workers suffered more than anyone on earth. Jenny probably wanted to interrupt and say, "Try doing laundry without soap, Karl." 3 of their 7 children died in infancy. Horrifically, preventable losses blamed on poverty, malnutrition, and bad sanitation. Marx mourned them, but even his grief came wrapped in theory. In his letters, he turned every tragedy into political commentary. 1 child died of bronchitis. Marx wrote that it demonstrates the inhumanity of bourgeois society, which is one way to avoid admitting you couldn't afford a doctor. He called poverty a revolutionary teacher. But it's easy to romanticize deprivation when you've got Engels' allowance incoming. Marx's ability to intellectualize suffering would have made him a hit on Twitter. every personal failure reframed as systemic critique. If the landlord evicted him, it wasn't because he hadn't paid. It was because the capitalist order fears the truth. Jenny, meanwhile, endured what can only be described as a slow-motion collapse. She kept the household running, begged friends for money, and patched their clothes so often they became metaphors for the economy. At one point, the family shared a single pair of decent trousers, meaning only one Marx could go outside, respectably dressed at a time. The father of communism, it turns out, was one pair of pants away from communing with the police. Despite the chaos, Marx insisted on maintaining intellectual appearances. He'd invite fellow radicals over to discuss philosophy, while Jenny scrambled to serve tea made from borrowed leaves. When critics accused him of hypocrisy, he argued that living among the poor gave his ideas authenticity. By that logic, a man sleeping under a bridge is just doing immersive journalism. His children adored him in bursts, feared him in others. He was brilliant but volatile, alternating between affectionate lectures and volcanic tantrums about the price of bread. His daughters grew up idolizing their father's mind and resenting his reality. They inherited his intellect, his idealism, and his total lack of financial stability. To Marx, all of it, hunger, illness, despair, proved capitalism's cruelty. To everyone else, it proved Karl's irresponsibility. The irony is brutal. He wrote about human liberation while his own family lived as hostages to his ego. Every unpaid bill became another footnote in his lifelong experiment, testing how far a man can stretch ideology before his children starve. And through it all, he remained convinced he was right. Poverty wasn't failure, it was evidence. Suffering wasn't shame, it was validation. If misery had a loyalty card, Marx was a platinum member. Das Kapital, a masterpiece. Nobody read. Das Kapital was Marx's life's work, his intellectual Everest, and also his greatest prank on future generations of undergrads. He started it in the 1850s, rewrote it endlessly, and died before finishing the later volumes. Engels had to cobble together the rest from half-legible notes, coffee stains, and what were probably arguments written mid-rage. The end product was a door-stopping, 3-volume critique of capitalism so massive that it could double as a blunt weapon in a workers' revolt. Marx poured everything into it, his obsession, his ego, his complete lack of self-editing. The result was, in parts, brilliant, a sweeping dissection of how labor, production, and profit intertwine. It was also practically unreadable. Even Engels, his most loyal fanboy, admitted that sections of the book are challenging. That's Victorian politeness for, "This makes my skull hurt." The tragedy and comedy is that Marx wrote about economics like a man describing a sport he'd never played. He understood capital in theory, but not in practice. He could diagram the exploitation cycle, but couldn't balance a household budget. Reading Das Kapital is like watching someone who's never held a wrench write a 900-page manual on engine repair. The sentences twist into knots of dialectics, footnotes multiply like bacteria, and any attempt to summarize it requires another 600 pages. Yet, despite its density, Das Kapital hit the 19th century intellectual scene like a thunderclap. It gave disillusioned thinkers a sense of order, history as a machine, grinding inevitably toward revolution. Marx offered an explanation for everything, from wage gaps to bad weather, that involved capitalism being evil. He didn't just write a book. He wrote an ideology that let millions of angry people say, "See, it's not my fault. I'm oppressed by the mode of production." Still, the irony lingered. Marx hated exploitation, but happily exploited Engels' factory profits to finance the manuscript. Every quill stroke railing against profit was literally sponsored by profit. When he denounced capital accumulation, he was cashing the 19th century equivalent of a trust fund check. When Das Kapital finally saw print in 1867, the reviews were polite, confused, or both. Critics praised its ambition, but noted it read like philosophy trying to disguise itself as algebra. Sales were modest. Marx hoped for a revolution. He got royalties that barely covered postage. He pretended not to care. Money was bourgeois nonsense anyway. But he still asked Engels to buy him more cigars. Over time, Das Kapital gained mythical status. Most people cited it, few actually read it, and almost no one understood it. It became the intellectual equivalent of a gym membership. Owning it made you feel morally superior without having to do any work. Professors still assign excerpts out of respect, or perhaps revenge. And yet, buried under the tedium, there's real genius. Marx correctly saw that unchecked capitalism breeds crises and inequality. His diagnosis was sharp, his cure disastrous. Das Kapital remains the strangest kind of classic, one admired by economists, feared by politicians, and finished by absolutely no one. Death, legacy, and the unpaid tab. Karl Marx's life ended exactly how it had been lived, broke, bitter, and behind on payments. By 1883, decades of poverty, illness, and bad decisions had worn him down. Jenny had already died 2 years earlier. 3 of their children were buried before them, and Engels was the only person left still willing to answer his letters. Marx's health collapsed under the combined weight of chronic bronchitis, liver problems, and a lifetime of never paying for heating. When he finally died in his London flat, there was no grand farewell, no mass mourning of a global thinker. The man who had dreamed of rallying the working class to rise up got a turnout of 11 at his funeral, less than the attendance at an open mic night in Camden. Engels, of course, footed the bill. It's fitting that Marx's last expense was once again covered by capitalism. The ceremony itself was bleak and rushed. A few comrades delivered stiff tributes about his immortal spirit, and Engels, visibly exhausted from decades of sponsorship, tried to sound inspiring while probably calculating how much the gravestone would cost. Marx was buried in Highgate Cemetery, surrounded by people who had, unlike him, paid for their plots. He left behind not wealth, but manuscripts, piles of half-finished notes, scribbled theories, and debts totaling more than his estate was worth. His surviving daughters spent years trying to organize his papers, though most of them were barely legible. Engels took charge again, editing and publishing the 2nd and 3rd volumes of Das Kapital, effectively ghostwriting his friend's afterlife. Without Engels' persistence, Marx's legacy might have faded into obscure pamphlets and unpaid receipts. At the time of his death, Marx was not famous. He was a fringe intellectual, dismissed by most of Europe as another failed radical. The irony, as always, came later. Within decades, his name would become synonymous with global revolution, his face a sacred icon for regimes that twisted his theories into weapons. He'd railed against monarchs, only to become one, the unelected king of ideological chaos. Marx's story could have ended as a tragicomic cautionary tale. A brilliant but impractical man who mistook personal failure for prophecy. But history, being the prankster it is, turned him into a prophet. His ideas outlived him by inspiring movements that promised equality, but delivered bureaucracy and famine. The dream of liberation he sketched in dim London rooms would eventually feed entire empires of authoritarian control. It's the ultimate Marxian punchline. His dictatorship of the proletariat became just another dictatorship. Today, his grave draws tourists and protesters alike. Some come to honor him, others to blame him. Few mention that the monument, a towering bust on a granite pedestal, was funded by the British Communist Party and built through private donations. Even in death, capitalism kept footing the bill. So there lies Karl Marx, history's most famous unpaid intern of revolution. A man who died, convinced the world would soon overthrow money, while owing everyone he ever met. The revolution didn't come for him, but the invoices did. The global afterlife of a guy who never got a job. If Karl Marx had known that his bearded face would one day become a logo, he might have demanded royalties. Though knowing him, Engels would have paid those too. A century after his death, his theories left the library and went global. Suddenly, governments, rebels, and idealists across the world were quoting Das Kapital like it was a self-help book. Half the planet tried to live by Marx's blueprint for utopia, and the other half stocked popcorn to watch it fail. The early adopters were revolutionaries who believed Marx had cracked the code of history. Russia took the lead, turning his ideas into a full-blown state religion. Lenin called him a prophet, Stalin called him gospel, and millions of peasants called him the reason we're starving. Marx had imagined a world of free, equal citizens. Instead, his theory spawned bureaucracies that made the British tax office look humane. China followed suit, Cuba jumped in, and Eastern Europe became a showcase of how efficiently Marx's dream could produce identical concrete buildings and chronic shortages. The workers owned the means of production, theoretically. In practice, the state did, which meant nobody did, which meant nothing worked. It was the ultimate experiment in what happens when you give everyone a hammer and tell them no one's in charge. And yet, his ideas refused to die. Every few decades, Marxism gets rediscovered by a new generation that hasn't read Das Kapital either. They quote him in college debates, tweet about late-stage capitalism, and sip lattes in cafes whose workers he'd have called petty bourgeois. Somewhere, Engels is ghost-laughing into his brandy. The irony only deepened with time. The man who wrote about abolishing private property became one of history's most marketable intellectuals. His face sells posters, tote bags, coffee mugs, and ironic hoodies. There's something almost poetic about it. Marx, the anti-capitalist messiah, turned into a lifestyle brand. The revolution was televised, monetized, and added to cart. Of course, not all his influence was tragicomedy. Marx's critique of inequality and exploitation still resonates. Even economists who hate him admit he diagnosed real problems. The tragedy is that his disciples turned analysis into dogma and theory into tyranny. Marx wanted to free humanity from economic slavery. His followers managed to enslave entire nations to the idea of freedom. In the modern age, his ghost lingers like a pop-up ad for revolution. Every financial crisis revives him. Every failed utopia buries him again. It's a cycle worthy of his own dialectic. Thesis, antithesis, disappointment. The man who never held a steady job somehow built an intellectual empire that refuses to go bankrupt. Today, Marx's legacy is a paradox. The world's most famous critic of capitalism, permanently employed by it. Universities teach him, publishers sell him, and his face smiles ironically from T-shirts made in the sweatshops he once condemned. If irony could resurrect the dead, Karl Marx would be alive and furious, not at capitalism, but at the fact that someone else owns the trademark to his beard. Karl Marx's ideas reshaped history. But his life? A perfect case study in why you should never take financial advice from a man whose rent was always overdue. He dreamed of equality but practiced dependency, preached revolution while borrowing bus money. The moral? Think critically, work hard, and for the love of Engels, pay your own damn bills.